This presentation is going to give you a few basics about intervals. When we talk about intervals, we're only referring to pitch, the highness or lowness of the sound. And when we talk about intervals, we're talking about two pitches and the space between them. And we can measure that and show some different sounds there. So each one of these intervals is going to have a unique sound. It's important to know that any interval can start on any pitch, high or low. We're just creating that interval by putting another note either above it or below it. And we're just going to focus in this class on the intervals up to 1 octave. If you don't know what an octave is, we'll get to that some other time. I want to give you a few general terms about intervals so that we have a good working vocabulary once we start listening to these and studying them. First of all, when two notes sound pleasing together, when two different notes sound pleasing, we call that a consonant interval. Some intervals are extremely consonant, some are somewhat consonant, and some are not consonant at all. When they clash or sound bad together, we would call those dissonant intervals. It's also important when you're listening to intervals, not just if they're consonant or dissonant, but how wide they are. Some intervals are very close together in dissonant, some of the intervals are wide apart in dissonant, and that'll kind of help you narrow it down when you're trying to hear these different sounds. There are a bunch of different terms that we use for these intervals. Major is based on the sounds in the major scale, basically, and then minor, which would be slightly smaller than the major interval equivalent, or kind of based on the minor scale. We haven't even studied scales yet, so that probably doesn't help you very much, but that's where they come from. Perfect intervals, which are extremely consonant, almost hollow sounding, strident sounding, and we'll understand why those are different than major intervals. When we talk about an interval being augmented, that means it's going to be slightly larger, and then of course the opposite of that, slightly smaller intervals will be labeled as diminished. When we're listening to these intervals, there are two ways you can do them. We can do melodic, that means one note is played after the other, or if they're harmonic, that means that both notes are played simultaneously. So a couple quick graphic illustrations here. So here, this length of this bar left to right we'll consider a major interval. If we were to make that a little bit longer, we would have an augmented interval, like I said before. If we looked at that major interval and made it a little bit smaller, that would become a minor interval. If we made it smaller, yeah, that's diminished, but we're really not going to deal with that in this class. Actually, we're not even really going to deal with any augmented intervals above a major interval. But we will with perfect intervals. When we have a perfect interval and we make it a little bit larger, then yes, that will become augmented, and there's one specific interval that we'll look at, which is an augmented perfect interval. And then of course if we made that smaller, just the converse, we would call that a diminished interval. You wouldn't go from having a perfect interval, making it smaller, to a minor interval or anything like that. We don't use minor or major when we're discussing perfect intervals, just augmented and diminished.